All right. Well, thank you guys for joining this webinar. We're talking about Blueprint to Success, which we are discussing the differences between special education evaluations done by the schools and private evaluations, and how these provide roadmaps to kind of where students need to be, figuring out where they needs to be worked on, and monopolizing on their strengths, all of those kinds of things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to go ahead and begin the webinar. So again, this is Blueprint. Thank you guys for being here again. I don't think I said that yet, but I know there's a bunch of people on the phone, and so we appreciate you guys all being here. This is, again, Blueprint for Success, how private evaluations drive academic success. So just a little bit about who we are. We are Cornerstone Educational Solutions, and we are a group of experienced, mostly psychologists. We mostly do psych, but we also have some speech and OTs that perform private evaluations and IEEs, independent educational evaluations for school districts when parents disagree. And we'll get into that in a little bit too. But we're a psych-owned agency since 2020. We have very experienced evaluators. All of our psychologists, everybody that works for us has had years. Our average is 12 years of experience in the field. So really experienced psychologists and leaders within our fields. We have neuropsychs. We have many doctoral. So we just have a really strong wonderful group of evaluators. And we work with a ton of advocates and attorneys to help support students' needs and to get second opinions a lot of times as well. So just a quick agenda, what we're going to be doing. This should be about 30 minutes, so it's not very long. There's also room for question and answers if anybody has any, but this shouldn't take very long. I just really want to give you kind of the basis of what we're doing. We're going to talk about what is a psychoed eval. We're going to talk about the difference between how certain evals are DSM diagnoses. So we're getting a diagnosis. And then the school district ones are special education eligibility is the main focus. And then we're looking at the difference between private and school-based evaluations and the role of private evaluations in understanding learning, how psychoeducational evaluations impact academic success, then how they create a roadmap towards success. And then we're going to look at a case study so you guys can kind of understand how that looks. So that's pretty much it. So let me move on. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to move my little bar that is covering the top of this. What is a psychoeducational evaluation? So really psychoeducational evaluation, a lot of people will hear it's called a psych assessment. So basically it is an assessment that evaluates a student's cognitive, academic, processing needs, the way our brain is wired, how we learn. We're looking at emotional functioning. We're looking at anxiety. A comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation looks at all of those things. We look on how a student learns, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and what are their challenges, and what are the growth points. So those are basically our what we look at. And then in the evaluation, we're looking at things like cognitive processing, academic skills. We're looking at all the processing abilities, and I didn't list them out, but that includes visual, auditory, visual motor integration, orthographic processing, phonologic processing. There's all these different areas, memory, working memory, all the different things that contributes to how we learn, how our brain functions and learns. So that is, and then we also look at attention and executive functioning, which is a huge, massive piece to learning. If you ever hear somebody that minimizes, oh, they just have attention issues, like it's not a big deal, it's a big deal. There is attention, and I've been a psych for 26 years. So in my experience, attention literally is probably one of the most impactful processing areas of everything because it impacts everything. And so we'll get into that a little more. Anyway, also we look at social emotional functioning, and then we also look at behavioral concerns. So that's kind of what a psychoeducational evaluation is. So now we want to look at certain evaluations go with DSM diagnoses, and some of them are based on special education eligibility. So we'll start with a private private psychoeducational evaluations. These are conducted by licensed educational psychologists. So these are psychs that are licensed. This is not a school district psychologist. This is a licensed psychologist. We are focusing on DSM diagnoses. So the DSM-5 TR is what we use now. And we are focusing on diagnosing whatever's going on. So the outcome of an evaluation could be that it is an ADHD diagnosis, a dyslexia diagnosis, which falls under learning disability, anxiety. There's all kinds of different diagnoses that could be outcomes of our evaluations when it is a DSM focus. They provide clinical and educational insight into learning and emotional health. So really, the focus of the evaluation is looking at what's going on with the student, where they're looking at it clinically, looking at it educationally, looking at how these things kind of intersect, and it gives us a lot of good information and obviously a diagnosis if one's appropriate. They're very thorough. They're very comprehensive, and they also look at learning styles and processing strengths and weaknesses. And the beauty of a private evaluation is that it creates a roadmap. So we're not just looking at if a student, like, are they eligible for special ed? We're looking at what can you do as parents? What can the school do to be able to move this child towards their goals, to move them towards whatever it is that we all have as a goal for that student based on what we find in the evaluations. So if we find out that reading is an area of concern, what do we need to do to get that child to where they need to be on grade level or whatever the ultimate goal is? So that is a private evaluation will give you a roadmap. And then again, it's independent of special education eligibility. Now, special education evaluations, and specifically the ones done in the school district, they're great evaluations. They're just, the focus of them is on eligibility, which means in-school services for an IEP. So they're really not going to give you that roadmap, so to speak, and there's not going to be as much in the processing pieces outside of, and some are great evaluations. I would never speak poorly of them. I was a school district psychologist for many, many years, but they're not looking at diagnosis. They're looking at eligibility. So we're looking so the scope is a little bit more narrow, and the testing tends to be a little bit more minimal, not quite as comprehensive, with less emphasis on areas that, like a social emotional, if that's not an area of concern, they're not going to get into it. Where private evals, they're going to. And then the other thing is that if you are a private school student and you qualify for special education in the schools, if you're a private school student, there is no services for you. You have to leave private school to go to the public school to be able to get services. So that's, again, a little bit of the what a special education evaluation looks like. Okay, so looking at private evaluations and looking at what we look at in a private evaluation, we're looking at ability. Again, we're looking at overall learning. We want to know exactly how this child learns. And when you walk away from a private evaluation, you should be able to completely understand the way this child learns. You should understand strengths, weaknesses, how those strengths can pull up those weaknesses to be able to get them where you'll have basically a very good understanding of the way your child learns. So we're going to be looking at ability. What is their ability, and does that ability set the baseline? So if we know a student has great ability, we need to understand that that student should be doing great academically. But if not, what's going on? Why is he or she not doing well? So that's the ability. Then we look at their current academic testing. So we look at all different levels of academic or all different academic areas, reading, writing, we look at everything, and we see where they're falling. Where's their levels? And based on the levels, we can kind of understand where we expect them to be, and then are they underperforming for their ability? We look at learning styles. We're always going to be looking at, are they an auditory learner, a visual learner? We get a ton of information from the processing testing we do, because the processing testing is telling us why the student is struggling. So if your student is struggling, the processing tells us why. It answers the question. It connects the dots. It's this impacts this, that impacts this. And, social emotional functioning, behavioral functioning is wrapped up in all of that. So really, processing testing is a huge deal. And sadly, I feel in my field, I feel like there's just not as much of an emphasis placed on it, and there should be, because it really does answer a lot of the whys. It's the why behind a student and why they struggle. Okay, we also look at attention and executive functioning and how that impacts the student's learning. And I said earlier, attention is one of the most impactful out of all of the processing pieces, and it really is. If a student's brain is always off task, it's never, so remember, when we talk about attention, it's not the lack of focus. It's not that, oh, my student can't focus. It's the hyper focus. It means their brain cannot differentiate what to focus on. So it focuses literally on everything. Every little thing popping up pulls their attention. So by the time they get back to what they're supposed to be learning is lost. So it's like popcorn in your head. It's just this constant, like, and so they may look and smile and look like they're, a lot of girls are like this. They'll look and smile and act like they're, paying attention, but their brain is elsewhere. So attention and executive functioning skills go hand in hand, and they definitely impact learning significantly. Executive functioning is really, it's a somewhat of a comorbidity with attention, and that's why we kind of put them together. But it's essentially the ability to utilize the world around you for the purpose of achieving a goal. It's being able to plan, organize, initiate. Like, a student gets a project and they jump right in and they know exactly what to do, and they get these supplies and they do this and they do that. Well, students with executive functioning, their issues, they're kind of like deer in the headlight. They don't even know where to begin. So that's also with attention. Anyway, we also get into a private evaluation is going to get into social emotional factors. We're going to see the impact of mood, anxiety, the lack of emotional regulation, being able to emotionally regulate themselves. And how does that impact their educational performance, their academics, all of these different things. And so really, and anxiety goes along with attention, goes along with emotional regulation. All of these things are like wrapped up. But if you don't do a real thorough evaluation, you're going to miss all of those pieces that you need to be able to use to triangulate the whole situation to understand completely what is going on with the student. So huge deal that you look into all of those different areas because they work off of each other. And processing speed is one of those things that a lot of people don't test for, but processing speed is how quickly you can absorb information. If it takes you, if you have slow processing speed, it is going to impact everything you do. And so there's just, again, you need to be looking in all of this. So the goal of a private evaluation is to develop a holistic understanding of the student's learning needs and challenges. Basically, how does the student's brain process information? How does it affect their learning? The whys to why a student struggles. And it helps create a roadmap and connecting the dots towards successful intervention. So that is our private eval. Now, again, I would never speak poorly of a special ed eval within the schools because I've been there, done that for many, many years. But a special education evaluation is a much more narrow focus. We're looking at eligibility criteria. You're still going to get into IQ. You're still going to get into academics. You may see some processing, not always, but a lot of times. In California, you tend to see a bit of processing, but you're definitely looking at criteria only for special education eligibility. So you may still have a student who has ADHD, but they may not qualify for special education. So just because you have a student that has a diagnosis of ADHD or autism or learning disability or whatever, doesn't mean they necessarily qualify for special education. So you don't really get a lot of triangulation. You don't get a lot of this is causing this. It's not really doing that for you as much with a school district evaluation because it's really focused more on that eligibility. So again, it's not looking at the whole picture of why a student struggles and how it impacts their daily living. It's really looking more at, do they qualify for services and what is it like in their educational setting? So in my opinion, I think you miss a lot when when your focus is a little bit narrow. But again, that's what a special education eligibility evaluation is. Okay. So the role of a DSM diagnosis in a private evaluation. Why is it important to have a DSM diagnosis? So often, when applicable, a DSM diagnosis like ADHD, anxiety, learning disorders, those kinds of things, are involved in a private evaluation when applicable, of course. And it's important because a DSM diagnosis can identify specific needs. It can tell you where the weakness is, but also not just a weakness, but enough to qualify with, not qualify, that's a bad word because we're talking about eligibility, but enough to diagnose a student with certain areas of concern. And then in turn, you can see how that impacts their academics. It also serves as a basis for potential intervention and therapies. There are a lot of insurances that if you do not have a DSM diagnosis, you cannot get ABA. You cannot get a lot of supports without a diagnosis from a DSM diagnosis. One of the other things that's really great, it can guide treatment, medication, therapy, specialized programs. All of those things are byproducts, can be byproducts of a DSM diagnosis. Whether or not you're a pro med or not pro med person, doctors are going to want to see a diagnosis for oftentimes to be able to try medication. But you got to think there's more than just ADHD medication out there. There's anxiety medication. And since COVID, man, kids are struggling. Kids are struggling with anxiety like I have never seen in my 26 years. It's crazy how impacted a lot of students are with anxiety. And so there's anxiety medication that really can help stabilize students that don't even need to be on it very long, but they just need to be able, and the emotional regulation as well. So much of that. And so a diagnosis will drive that and allow for access to that. It also provides accommodations, access to accommodations. So within the school setting, let's say we have an ADHD kid and they really need some accommodations. They need tests given in a quiet environment. They need possibly the test read out loud because their brain just jumps around. They might have all these different accommodations. And with a diagnosis, you can definitely, it lays the foundation to be able to have those accommodations in a private school, public school, whatever the setting, it definitely lays that foundation. So the impact of a DSM diagnosis, again, it can lead to the therapies, it can lead to medication management. With accommodations specifically, I did a webinar about a month ago on the how to prepare for accommodations within the college and university setting. And one of them is you need to have an updated psych report. Most of the schools are going to want that. Not all of them. There's sometimes that you could get away with it, but most schools are going to want that. But they also want it for SAT and ACT accommodations and other standardized testing accommodations. So without that, without a psych report, without a private evaluation and a DSM diagnosis, typically you're not going to necessarily see it. Diagnosis you don't necessarily have to have, but you need to have, you need to show that there is a need and that with the extra supports, like the extra time or whatever, that's helped you. So it can't just be like, oh, now you need it and before you were totally fine. You have to show that there's a history of this. College accommodations. People don't even realize what colleges will do for their kids. They literally will give all kinds of accommodations to help support them, like extra time, tutoring, adjusted learning environments. There's so many things that colleges do. Best part, priority registration. You get great, oftentimes you get priority registration, which is awesome because you're the first ones to get to register. So it's really great, a lot of accommodations. And then increased support, tailored interventions to support academic performance and emotional health. So a lot of times with our emotional health, we'll have, if the student's in a school environment and they have a safe spot that they could go to when they're feeling overwhelmed, where they're feeling like they could tell their body is starting to tense up, they have the wellness center. They can go to the wellness center. So we basically create accommodations embedded within the students' daily activities that will allow for them to kind of emotionally regulate, keep the anxiety down, and those kinds of things. So again, all of that is kind of hinged on a really good assessment, and a DSM diagnosis helps quite a bit. I wanted to give a little bit of, and I am going really fast. I hope I'm not going too fast, but I wanted to give a case study, just so you guys can kind of see what this looks like in with a typical student. So this is a student with reading, attention, and executive functioning concerns. This is, I would probably say, 60% of our students have this exact profile. So I thought this would be a good one to kind of show. So background information, this is a 10-year, and this is actually true. This is a real case. 10-year-old student, fifth grader, and the student struggles with basic reading. So they didn't really struggle with comprehension. If somebody read it out loud to them, they're like, heck yeah, I got it. And they seemed like they were bright. They seemed like they had good ability, but they really struggled with decoding the words. They could not, every word they got to, it was like, they couldn't do it. And so because of that, they were slow, labored readers, took forever to read anything. And then based on them reading it themselves, well, if you're slow and labored, well, what's going to happen? You're not going to comprehend what you're reading because it takes you so long to get through it. And every word you're trying to decode. It was just really poor reading skills, decoding skills. They also struggled difficulty focusing and staying on task to non-preferred academic settings. So for instance, this student was really great at math, loved math, but hated reading, hated writing. And so what do? They just avoided it like the plague. So of course, that when those subjects came up, their brain is like everywhere else. They're thinking in their brain what they're going to have for lunch, what they're going to do tomorrow, what they're going to do after school. So they basically really struggled with focusing. And they also saw it kind of across settings. It wasn't just like a academic specific, it was across settings. The parents saw concerns, but they did great when they were interested in something like science or math for this student. They also struggled they had difficulty organizing, initiating tasks. They had a very messy desk. It was one of those where you look at the desk, you're like, I have no idea how they find anything in there. And they had difficulty completing assignments. So you see a lot of those executive functioning concerns in that as well. Okay, so we did the full assessment. We did all of the testing, and here is what we found. We found that this student had a learning disorder, which essentially is dyslexia. It was a DSM diagnosis. So they had difficulty with phonological processing. So when that student came to a word, they struggled. They didn't have all those natural blending. I know that the C and the L say "kull" instead of going "k." Oh, they didn't blend well. They didn't segment well. They weren't able to see ing and go, ooh, that's ing. They struggled to sound out the words. They didn't have those foundational pieces. They also struggled with sight words. They did not create that picture of the word in their brain of the sight word. So that's called orthographic processing. So they didn't just have trouble decoding the words, but they also struggled to create the sight words. The only way to learn to read is to decode the word. And after you've decoded the word 5 to 7 times, you should turn that word into a sight word. If you don't turn that word into a sight word, you're never going to be a fluent reader. You're never going to be able to read with speed. And then you're never going to be able to comprehend because you're going to struggle with the length of time it takes you to read. So this student not only struggled with decoding the word, but then they didn't turn it into a sight word, which meant they were a very, very slow, labored reader. So they were dyslexic. So that was one of their DSM diagnoses. So that was the first one. And then the second one was the student definitely had ADHD. This was, I want to say they were ADHD combined type, but again, I am not remembering off the top of my head. So the ADHD, they had difficulty maintaining focus. They had difficulty staying organized and planning tasks. They had that desk where you're like, oh my goodness, it was insane. But again, it was impactful enough that they qualified under DSM diagnoses. They also showed that executive functioning weakness where they had trouble with that organization, that initiation. They would get a project and it was like the deer in the headlights I said earlier. They have no idea where to begin. Everything is just so, it's like they don't know where to start. And so because of that, they don't know how to organize because they don't know how to start. And so they can't complete the task. So they needed a lot of support in that area. So again, that was our findings for the psychoeducation. Those were all DSM diagnoses. So then we took that and we turned it into a roadmap. So this is what a typical evaluation would take a look at. So we'd first say, okay, we know that we have dyslexia. We know that there are some reading needs there. So what's our intervention plan? So first of all, it would be implementing a structured reading program such as a Lindemood Bell or a Barton. These programs that are research-based that target phonological processing skills so they can recognize, they can decode words, they can sound words out. We're also going to look for that program that is going to be orthographic processing. That's going to focus on that visual memory and word recognition and be able to really turn that into a sight word in their brain so that they could turn around and decode the words, but also spell the words. If you don't have a picture of the word in your brain, you're not going to be able to spell, or you're just going to do it phonetically, and then you're probably going to be wrong once you get past about first grade when the words don't sound like what they look like. So orthographic processing is a huge deal. And then expected outcomes would be to improve reading speed, comprehension, and fluency as the student strengthens their decoding and word recognition skills. So once we fix those baseline processing pieces, the phonological processing, the orthographic processing, we lay those foundations, then the other stuff comes. So it's just, you have to attack it at that base level, or the next step's not going to come. So that is definitely first part of the intervention strategies for that. Now, when we get into ADHD, then we're looking at, this parent was interested in medical intervention. So they were going to go to their doctor. They were going to talk to the doctor about possible meds. That's definitely their, any parent has that choice. Nobody can make you do anything. And if a school tells you have to, you tell them, no, thank you. You do what is best for you and your family. No school can force you into doing any of that. But I recommended an executive functioning coach. There are so many executive functioning programs and coaches out there now. There's so many. I actually heard the other day that they do executive functioning coaching through Roblox. So that little game that kids play, they actually can do it through, and social skills training through Roblox, which I thought was so cool. Meet them where they're at, man. Get them, that's what they do. Come to that level and work with them there. So really cool. So a referral to a trained executive functioning coach to work on organizational skills, creating schedules, breaking down tasks, chunking it together to know how to get it done. Time management strategies, using planners, setting reminders. I use reminders in my phone constantly. And a lot of people just don't even know that you could do that. So those kinds of things. And then self-regulation. The student did struggle a little bit with self-regulation, but self-regulation doesn't even need to be like, I'm blowing up and freaking out. Self-regulation could be that, I'm noticing my brain is wandering. How do I bring myself back? Do I need to fidget? Do I need to do, some sort of Velcro thing on my desk where I'm like, what keeps my attention? And how do I recognize when my body is starting to do those things? And how do I bring it back? So that is self-regulation. That's a huge thing to teach kids. Such an important thing. And it doesn't even have to be for those kids that are having behavioral issues or emotional issues. It could be for those attention kids as well. Expected outcomes: improve ability to plan, organize, and complete assignments on time. So there you go for the attention one. Then we look at our accommodation plan. What do we do in the school setting? So we have all kinds. So a 504 accommodation plan is something that you would have in a public school setting. You don't necessarily have it in a private school, but a lot of private schools have come a long way. And they're now really doing a lot of these learning plans. They all call it something different, but basically where they are creating an accommodation plan for students who need it. Bright kids that could do very well but they just need some extra supports in those areas. So we recommended for this student extended time for reading and writing assignments, to reduce the impact of the processing speed issues, quiet testing environment to minimize distraction and enhance focus, frequent breaks to address attention issues and increase task completion, use of assistive technology, text to speech. Our attention kids, the thought of having to write a paragraph literally almost is blows their mind. Like, that is so difficult for them to think. But if they can learn with some of this assistive technology, like text to speech, some of these other things, that they can get it down on paper and then go back and edit it sometimes it's a game changer for kids. So we want to be able to, utilize that assistive technology where it's appropriate. And then written instructions for tasks and assignments to provide clarity, and that the written instructions also help with those memories and the memory and the focus issues. So the expected outcome of this would be accommodations will provide students with a level playing field to demonstrate mastery of academic content without being hindered by their disabilities. So we're leveling the playing field. Non-disabled kids here, you've got this kid that has some level of learning disability, whatever the disability, and they're way down here. They do not have a fair playing field. So we're trying to remove those barriers to get them to the same level, to be able to access the curriculum and to be able to show that they know what they're doing outside of their disability. So if that means that they need to answer orally instead of writing it down, no issue. Why not? That should be something that absolutely should be accommodated for them. So, okay, so next we have implementation and monitoring timeline. I do usually in my evaluations, we do phases. So we have a phase 1, which is the immediate, what we need to work on first, then a phase 2, which is the next. And then, so we kind of tier it on what's the most important. So obviously we would want to get the implementation of the reading program, because you've got to get that basic reading skill. We've got to get that done. And the initiation of the executive functioning coaches, schedule a consultation with the doctor, ensure the accommodations are in place in school. That's a huge one. So you get that meeting on the books and get that scheduled. Regular check-ins with students' progress, and then adjustments to accommodations, therapies, and strategies based on the feedback of what we're experiencing. So that is the implementation of the timeline. Similarly, we also do all of that, what I just went through, also can be done through an independent educational evaluation, which is an IEE. So it's a private evaluation, but it's an independent evaluation. I don't work for the school district. I don't work for the parent. We are coming in as a neutral third party to determine what a student needs, but it's structured very similar to the private evaluation, although we also look at eligibility for special ed, and we still give those recommendations. And that is a huge, if you work with an attorney and advocate, they usually will make that suggestion that you get an IEE, but we definitely do a lot of IEs, and it's your right as a parent. If you disagree with anything about the evaluation that has been provided to you, it is your right to request an IE, which is paid for by the school. So important for parents to know that. And it needs to be a legit concern. It can't be just, I didn't like the psych. Well, okay, great. But if you truly disagree with something like you said, this does not look like my kid. You had the wrong name in the report, and I don't feel like this is my kid's, you can ask for an IE. So it's a good thing to ask for when needed. Okay, so summary. So basically, we went over what a psych eval is. We went over how the evaluation how this evaluation led to the targeted interventions, all of the accommodations and supports, and basically a personalized plan for the student to succeed, to get them from where they're at now, utilizing their strengths and weaknesses, and getting them to where they need to be. That is so important. But if you don't have an evaluation that tells you how your kid learns, you're not going to know where to aim. I always liken it to without an evaluation, it's like you're trying to throw darts at a dartboard, but you're blindfolded. I have a complete blindfold on, and I'm standing there trying to throw darts at a bullseye. Well, how are you going to hit the bullseye if you're blindfolded? So if you don't know what is going on with your kids' learning, you're not going to be able to hit the bullseye. You're not going to be able to get them where they need to be because you don't know where you're supposed to go. And so many parents spend so much money on therapies and so much money on different interventions, but they never started with an evaluation. And if you would, and come on, tutoring, oh my goodness, it's so crazy how much money these parents spend. But if you would have backtracked to go, I need to know what's going on first, it would have made it would have targeted the interventions for success for the student. So anyway, so that's the blueprint for success. So now I am going to stop my record so that we can ask questions if anybody has any. All right, let me stop. All right.